Welcome to the 2021 Market Measure webinar. So we've wrapped up another year. That was kind of another remarkable year for the independent home improvement industry. And this webinar is a complement to the Market Measure report that was published in Hardware Retailing and Paint and Decorating Retailer in the January issues. So follow along with those copies if you've got them. So on today's presentation, we've got Dan Tratensek from the North American Hardware and Paint Association and Grant Farnsworth of the Farnsworth Group to kind of talk a little bit about the data that was presented in this report. And we kind of wanted to start off kind of talking just generally about what the Market Measure report is. So Dan, you're a little bit of a veteran in that regard. So tell us about kind of the origins of Market Measure and what retailers can do with the data that's in this report.
Yeah, I think that Market Measure, and we have so many different projects and terms that become kind of like this lingo that we use, and Market Measure is really kind of the subtext of it is the annual report for the home improvement industry. And as Hardware Retailing and Paint Decorating Retailer are magazines, but we're really the communications vehicles for the North American Hardware and Paint Association. And as the association for independent retailers in hardware and paint, we've always really seen it as our responsibility to kind of gauge what's going on in this market, in this home improvement market. So for many years, every year we have been conducting our Market Measure report to put some perspective on really what's going on more at that macro level for the industry. What are the trends beyond just what we're seeing in the retail stores? What's going on industry wide? What are consumers doing? What's the housing market doing? What are some of those external influences that are really shaping the market as a whole? And so again, we publish this every year. And where it is of use to retailers is we try and give it to them at the end of the year, beginning of the new year, as a way to really take stock and say, wait, what have we been through and where are we going? And to really understand, here are the things that are going on outside of the walls of your business that you would likely want to consider as you are planning for growth or you're planning to adjust your business for anything that might kind of be beyond your control as a business leader. So we try and put information in there about the size of the home improvement market. We try and put information in there about the housing market or other economic trends that might be impacting home improvement. But we also include in there information from our cost of doing business study, which really gets you down to the store level and talks about store level performance. And all of these pieces we really kind of recommend that retailers use when they're doing their planning to give a little bit more, to have a little bit more information at their disposal when they're starting to really try and think of what can I do to grow my business, or what are the things that I need to be prepared that might be coming my way. So that's really kind of the purpose of Market Measure and how retailers can use it.
So Grant, I feel like a lot of what Dan just said is probably really familiar to what you do every day with the Farnsworth Group. So can you talk a little bit about how the Farnsworth Group serves the home improvement industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Farnsworth Group is a custom market research firm that's focused exclusively in the building products home improvement industry, and we have been for 30 plus years. So where we love the work that NHPA does and Market Measures is it is a great foundation of understanding, as Dan said, not only where we've been over the last 12 months, but what's around the corner over the next 12. Our job then as the Farnsworth Group is to help those retailers, suppliers, and certainly the manufacturers dig a few layers deeper to understand their particular business, right? Their specific category, their specific geography, to see what translates to them, what trends they should really be paying attention to in their market, which may be less so, et cetera. So it's a really nice kind of 1-2 when we get to be able to use Market Measures as that initial conversation and context of what to be thinking about, just as Dan mentioned, to then have discussions. All right, so here's the gaps you need to start thinking about and filling in. That's where, as the Farnsworth Group, we come in and conduct qualitative, quantitative research designed around their specific needs. to get, again, a much more finite understanding of their customer, their brand, or their product.
Great. So I think we all understand that the last 2 years now have just kind of been a little unusual, especially when it comes to data and tracking these sorts of things. In this market measure report, we talked about how the models that are typically used just haven't been, they don't function the same way with the numbers that have been coming out. So, Dan, can you kind of talk about how your strategy, I guess, or NHPA's strategy for collecting these or analyzing these numbers has shifted?
Yeah, I mean, it was really a lesson learned in 2020. I think when you look at any kind of financial models, particularly models that are built on years and years and years of data, anybody who looks at kind of financial trends understands that most things are cyclical, and you could almost, when you're in a regular pattern, count on, if this happened in April, May, and June, this will likely happen in July, August, September. And what happened in 2020 was we were seeing things that don't fit that model, you couldn't look at the next month, the next 30 days, the next 60 days, the next 90 days and say, well, if the industry performed this way in 2019, 2018, 2017, 2016, it will likely perform that way in 2020. It just didn't happen that way. And I mean, even when I talk about it anecdotally, all the retail groups that we talk to and kind of keep tabs on, they would say the same thing. They would say, oh, well, sales have been terrific for the first 3 months of the year, but I think things are really going to drop off or level out next month. And in 2020, that just didn't happen. I mean, it was like, sure, there were some peaks and valleys, but you were generally riding this wave that just kept going up and up and up. So the modeling that we typically do to kind of say, well, we know that these months typically perform that way. We really had to throw that all out the window and really kind of shoot from the hip. And I'm sure we weren't the only group that found ourselves doing that. And so even when we get to the end of the year and try and put our numbers together, we're typically pulling numbers through maybe 10 months of the year to try and come up with our estimate of what the entire year looks like. And we were using models at the time saying, oh, well, things are going to slow down, or we're going to estimate that it's going to be somewhere between what it was and what it is. And so we were even more conservative. Then when we look back, we're like, well, wait a minute, things didn't slow down. And so we've really been having to kind of tweak those knobs as we're going forward to try and figure out, how does this work? I mean, going into the end of 2020, no one assumed, I mean, everybody was saying, oh, if I could just be flat or slightly down from what I posted in 2020 and 2021, that'd be a huge win. Well, now we just finished 2021 and we know that wasn't the case. We know that pretty much everybody was up pretty strong throughout the year. And so, that being said, as we move forward in this conversation, we'll talk about how we think things are going to normalize a little bit more. But the last 2 years, it's just been, strap in and look at stuff as it comes out because the models just didn't work. I don't know, Grant, if you guys kind of had that same kind of experience.
Yeah, listen, we feel for economists right now. I can tell you that. And Dan, I think to your point, it was all about consistent adjustments. What you thought this month you're going to revise next, simply because the expectation of what you saw the data do in the prior 15 years wasn't happening. So yeah, Dan, we were seeing a lot of the same things. We were hearing a lot of the same things. We were using forecasts and data and talking with our economist friends, and it was constantly being revised. So it was just incredibly difficult to put your thumb on any one point and say that this is going to stick, because it just didn't seem to be the case. And this time around, what I will say is that it was for the positive. Those revisions just would go up. It wasn't that we were revising down and, oh my gosh, we thought we were going to be doing better than we were. So I think that was a nice, unique change as well. Oftentimes when we're, in down cycles, it is, oh gosh, this is actually worse than we realized, or demand is softer than we realized, or the spend is lower than. all the revisions week after week, month after month, just kept going up, up, up. So I mean, that is the upside, but it certainly was challenging. That's for sure, and I think it still is to a certain degree, and it's going to be.
Yeah, and I remember, we've had such a close relationship between our two organizations for so long that we always, we certainly use each other as resources. And I remember when we were putting our numbers together toward the end of 2020, reaching out to you and saying, "Hey, can I talk to some people on your team? Because I'm not sure about these numbers, and what do you guys think?" And we kind of all got our heads together, and I was like, and got the feedback from you guys about, we're dealing with the same issues.
Yep. So it's tough.
I mean, I think we were all kind of in that same boat. And it always reminds me of, when you learn how to drive, people say, it's all about taking the wheel and just making a little minor revisions. Well, in 2020 and 21, it was more like this, and we'll see. Here we are in the first month of 2022. So buckle in, and I think I know kind of what I anticipate to happen. At least we put it down in print what we think is going to happen. But hey, we'll see.
Yeah, I spend very little time crunching numbers, but the time that I did, dig my hands into this report, it's certainly remarkable. And the conversations we were having with retailers all last year was, there's no possible way we can be bigger than 2020,
right.
And yet that still happened for a good
right.
portion, of the industry. So let's start talking about those numbers. Dan, before we got on this call, you had said you really can't talk about 2021 without talking about 2020. They just have to coexist. And so we did touch on that in the market measure report. So what were kind of those data points that came out of?
And I think even when you talk to retailers now, they talk about stacked growth. They talk about stacking 18 months or 24 months and really referring to that as a separate thing. And that's really what I'm talking about here. Is it's really hard to put 2021 in perspective without first talking about 2020. And what we really see is that in a lot of ways, that 18-month, 2-year period is really kind of crammed together. And there's still some pent up effect that we're going to see have an influence, really for several years to come in a lot of the ways that independent retailers, and I think the industry at broader sense, is operating. And let me talk about a couple things like that. Like we talked about the fact that it was so hard to predict. Well, I've been around in the industry long enough that I've seen us go through tremendous growth cycles. In the mid 90s, late 90s, we went through this big growth cycle where kind of the big boxes were coming into their own, and there was the DIY revolution was really in full swing. But it was upward growth, but it was gradual upward growth. Then we saw, what Grant was referring to during the housing crash and all that. We saw a sudden decline, but we never saw the kind of growth that we saw in 2020 and then 2021. But we never saw that kind of growth happen in such a short period. And you hear the term about information, like drinking from a fire hose. In a lot of ways, that's what happened to the industry with this growth, and it's why we're seeing so many issues with the supply chain and hiring and all those kind of things. Is because we had this amount of growth, which everybody kind of hopes for, but we had it in such a short period of time that it really became problematic. So 2020 was the start of this stacked period, if you will, but it was the biggest single year of growth that we ever recorded as long as we have been looking at these market measure numbers. Now, someone might say, Dan, in 1946, there was a lot stronger growth. Let's say, just like in baseball, we're talking about the modern era of retailing. That. So, but we recorded growth year over year from 2019 to 2020 of more than 22% for the industry. And we pegged industry sales for all of home improvement at roughly about $497 billion. And that was just like this huge reset. It was just, okay, there's the pre-pandemic period for the industry, then there's the post-pandemic. And this was the start of that new epoch for home improvement sales. And that was really how it reset. When we're talking about specifically about independent retailers, they also saw this tremendous growth. The industry grew, but growth for independent retailers was right along with that. According to our numbers, the average independent home improvement retailer in 2020 reported growth of about 22.6% of sales. And they also, according to our look at the industry, were able to grow their market share by about 40 basis points. And so a lot of this was having this outsized impact on independent operators. And this created this tremendous kind of downstream financial sea change for independent retailers as well. So not only, you had this, and it's way overused, so I'll put $1 in the jar, this unprecedented time for financial performance for independent retailers. And when you look at some of what we saw, not only were they posting all of these record increases in sales, but their profits were higher than we've ever recorded. Hardware stores, on average, in our cost of doing business study for 2020, posted net operating profits, the average stores, of 8.9%. That's about 3 times what we typically see for a hardware store on the net operating side. The high performers, the top quartile, were at almost at 14.5% operating. These stores had the highest sales per customer, the highest ever cash as a percentage of their assets. And that really kind of bled through to the other store types. The hardware stores, the home centers experienced the same thing. 6.7% average profit in net operating profit in 2020. Saw their customer counts increase by 15.5%. Return on net assets, 3 times what it typically is. Same thing for lumberyards. Highest average annual sales volume per store in our cost of doing business study. Paint stores, highest ever net operating profit at 8%. And what was really driving this was, remember, we were talking about drinking from this fire hose. All these sales were coming in. These stores didn't have the time to increase that expenses to accommodate it. Plus, they were kind of blunted by, the ability to do so in this COVID environment. So they didn't engage in a lot of growth outside of just in terms of new store growth or adding new niches or things like that. They couldn't really grow their employee count, all that stuff. So one retailer we talked to, and I've used this quote before, summed it up really well. In 2020, there was no way we could spend as fast as the sales that were coming in. And so what that left in 2021, and spoiler alert, it's carrying forward right now, is that these stores, these independent stores, have come off of 2 of the greatest years. They've had 2 of their most profitable years, and they're sitting on a lot of cash. And that's going to continue to have repercussions, again, in the industry over the next 3 to 5 years. And later on, maybe we can talk a little bit about what some of those repercussions will be. And some are positive, and quite honestly, some are negative. And you could even talk about, what if the supply chain had held out? In 2021, we saw that sales lift carry over. We saw that profitability carry over. We pegged that about halfway through the year when we did a survey and asked independent retailers. In 2021, they were saying that their sales were about 14.5% over where they were for the previous year. Now that, in our estimation, that cooled off a little bit. We had what we called a little bit of a summer swoon in sales, and we pegged industry growth at about 8 to 8.2, 8.5%. Again, we'll have to look at those numbers again when the final numbers come in for the last few months of the year. But we just, again, that same kind of performance, you got to look at in that kind of 2-year stack of information to say, wow, we're coming into 2022 with a full head of steam, and it has been a remarkable period. But there's also been remarkable challenges and difficulties for independent retailers and the industry at large during this time.
What I would comment too. Yes, go ahead, Melanie.
I was just going to pass it to you to kind of share, your thoughts. You spent a lot of time nodding in agreement, and so I assume that you were kind of going to reflect on, Farnsworth's notes.
I'd like to just be like shaking his head no and waving his hands when I'm saying it.
Listen, Dan, you're a smart man, so there's a lot to agree with and a lot to nod along to. I would say to the 2020 piece, Dan is spot on, and we're right there with you, right? Which is you've got to acknowledge what happened and what was fascinating about 2020, unlike other growth periods we've seen in this industry. And this is coming from a company as the Farnsworth Group. We've been looking at this industry and studying it for over 30 years now. 2020, the growth was so darn concentrated, right? In other growth years, we might have seen multiple areas kind of firing, right? Existing contractor work is going gangbusters. Some DIY behaviors are going strong. New housing starts, single family are going strong. Maybe we've got some multifamily coming. So there might be some various ships that are all kind of rising at the same time to get this overall gain where everybody's happy. But in 2020, it was so concentrated on existing home DIY activity. That's what's really, really fascinating. So for us, and I think the industry, there's two things that happen. One, the expectation is, well, they surely have burnt themselves out in 2020 doing DIY work, so that's got to be gone, right? Wrong. The other thing is we've got to look at, well, what didn't happen in 2020? And that's where I think Dan is talking about some of this pent-up work, pent-up demand, pent-up projects that really stalled out, particularly on the contractor side, for a good 3 to 5 months. We've got data that shows when we were tracking it on a monthly and weekly basis that upwards of 80% of contractors were reporting delayed or canceled projects in March, April, and May. That number now, over the last few months, is anywhere between 35 and 45%. So there's still that window of projects that just didn't happen in 2020 that we recovered from a little bit in 2021. But I promise you, as we look at our forecast as the Farnsworth Group, we're really, really bullish on existing home contractor activity because that's what was missing from that 2020 picture. So I think it's really, really important to understand that, yes, we had that growth, that stacked, aspect to everything is really, really important. But where did it come from and where didn't it come from to be able to get a perspective on what we can be planning for or building in 2022, 2023?
I think what will be interesting to kind of follow is kind of just how consumers have adjusted to this new life. And so, like you said, Grant, like what are people still doing to their homes because employers are more flexible with work from home and, we saw challenges with the housing market. So people were trying to get out really early on and then inventory has been so low. And so I'll be interested to see how that tracks this year as people are still focusing on creating spaces in their homes to live in them and to work in them.
Yeah, we've certainly got some data around that as well. First and foremost, I think it's important to understand an underlying fundamental that we were well underbuilt pre-COVID as far as affordable new homes in this country. So there was a systemic issue with housing before COVID was even a thought. This has compounded that issue because we do have more mobility happening in this country than we ever have before. Again, prior to COVID, our mobility rates were changing. Historically, we would have homeowners stay in their home for around 10 years. Pre-COVID, we were getting down to around 7.5. So we were already seeing mobility rates increase pre-COVID. Now we've looked at the migration over the last 2 years and seen that mobility is changing even more. Those in the higher density urban cores more likely to move elsewhere, looking for homes that may or may not exist. So there's a real demand that was there pre-COVID, and that has only increased during COVID. And I would say too that as we think about some of those fundamentals, we look at home ownership rates. And I think what is really, really telling about this shift is as of Q3 of 21, home ownership rate was over 65%. This home ownership rate has rebounded very, very quickly in 2020 and 2021. Back in 2018-19, we were in the 60% range. Within a couple of years, we added 4 to 5 points on home ownership. You may say, well, that's only 4 or 5%. That's 4 or 5% of adult populations in the U.S. That's a boatload of people. So, as we think about what's driving activity and what's going to be driving sales, I think there's a lot of conversation on the new homeowner side of things. And Melanie, you're right. The way that people use their home, what they want in a home, has changed. We've all been left with an imprint to a certain degree or another. And we've been shocked to see data, even on the DIY side, that remains strong. When we look at project intent amongst DIYers, we're consistently in this 72, 76% are planning to do something next month. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when we were in Q4 or Q1, that intent was somewhere around 65%. So we've been tracking consistently for the last 2 years above historical norms when it comes to DIY project intent. So new home builds, underbuilt, contractor project work, pent up, higher home equities than we've ever had. We increased the equity in Q3 year over year by, 3.2 trillion in Q3 of 21 over Q3 of 2020. We have more equity in our homes in this country than we've ever had. There are so many factors playing to our strengths in the building product and home improvement industry that we're very bullish on 2022, 2023. A lot of it, Melly, back to your question, is being driven with, well, I want to use my home differently. It needs to feel different. It needs to look different. And I have limited options on how to get there. I can't just go out and buy a new house because there may not be one available, or there may not be a price that I'm willing to pay. So I'm going to reinvest in my home to build out what I need in today's new world. I know that was a long-winded answer, but it is having a dramatic impact on some real positive behaviors for the next couple of years.
But Grant, wait, millennials aren't going to buy homes.
That's right. Millennials aren't going to buy a house, and they're not going to have children, right? Blown out of the water. Dan, you and I both have talked about this at length. We've seen the data. Delayed, yes, but we tell our clients all the time, you need to think about phase of life, not age in life.
Yeah. And, I think that it's one of those things that makes it so difficult, particularly on the predictive side right now. But we really felt, and when we looked at these numbers, is that, it's all the signs and everything you talked about, Grant, points to this sustained growth for the industry and all these factors. But when we looked at predicting kind of size of industry moving forward, we were a little bit more conservative. We really think that we stepped up this big stair over these last 2 years, and we're going to go into a pattern that's more recognizable for us, into that 4.5%, 5% growth. Because I think there are also some things that, if you watch the news anytime in the last week, the Fed is talking about as much as 4 interest rate hikes this year. And a lot of that, I was talking to someone and they said, we were talking about the supply chain and when will the supply chain smooth out and when will everybody be able to catch up? And they said something that, I've heard so many things for the first time, things that I never thought I would hear. And they said, quite frankly, we're not going to get the supply chain straightened out until people stop buying stuff. We need people to slow down on buying stuff. Crap, I remember talking to a manufacturer early on in this and saying, we need people to slow down buying. And I'm like, I never thought I would hear someone that sells stuff for a living saying, I wish people would start buying less, But I think there's some truth to that. And I think that's what you're seeing with some of these prospective interest rate hikes, not only to kind of temper this crazy inflation that we're seeing in a lot of areas, but also, I forget the number you put out there, but trillions in equity unlocked for homeowners. My gosh, what happens if everybody starts tapping into that equity to put on a patio and a porch and so on, given what's going on in the supply chain right now? So what might temper some of that would be interest rate hikes. If it's all of a sudden going to cost me a little bit more for that home equity loan or to get into that equity, that could slow it down. But I will be the first to admit, we looked at a compound annual growth rate moving forward of about 4.7%. I'll be, well, I don't know if I'll be happy to be wrong, but I don't know that anybody would look at me and say, if I was predicting we're going to have this strong growth and then we fall off a cliff, people would say, damn, what the hell were you guys thinking? But, I think we're being a little bit conservative about it just because there's so many things out there that we just don't know right now. But 100%. If you look at the market right now, it is primed for continued growth in this industry. It is a good time, which is, I think, one of the reasons you're starting to see a lot of these venture capital companies, a lot of these equity investors that are turning their heads saying, lumber and building materials and hardware and home improvement might be a good space to be in right now.
Bad. Well, I think so, Dan, you brought up some of the headwinds for the industry. Availability, supply chain is certainly one that we've been talking about now for a while, and pricing is another. The others that we're keeping an eye on, certainly on the new housing side, is land. Land prices are starting to get a little bit out there, but we've now got options to buy C lots in suburbs and states that otherwise people weren't ever moving to. And the last is labor. So what I think is interesting about all four of those, Dan, I think you're right. I think that's going to subdue not only some demand, I don't know if it's going to subdue enough for us to catch up and get our breath, but I think it's going to subdue enough to equate to sustained growth.
Right.
As opposed to this hockey stick that we've seen in past cycles where we do have all the resources at our disposal. We've got enough labor. We've got enough material. Price points are low. So let's go ahead and build 2.2 million home starts this year. We don't even have that option, despite the fact that demand is there. So I think in a way it is inhibiting some growth, which is probably a positive for our industry because now we can maintain some sort of sustained 4 or 5% for several years rather than ramp up real fast and then go, oh, great, what next?
Yeah. And I also think that, when you look at, when we looked at 2021 and 2020 was a little harder to get our arms around, but we thought that we put a number of about 8%, that we thought supply chain challenges cost about 8% in growth. And that's a huge amount. And anecdotally, all of the retailers that we talked to that said, man, if I could have got more product on my shelf, I could have sold it, And so those things, and as people continue to engage in projects and more contractors are taking on more jobs and so on, I think, it's an abnormal period, but anybody who looks at economics and financial patterns understands that all things, you could have wild swings, but everything kind of comes back toward middle. Yep. And I think we're going into that period of over the next 5 years where I 100% agree. In a great term, it's not going to be that hockey stick of growth, but it's going to be a more measured growth that still we're predicting is going to be slightly above average. I mean, but it's still just going to be more measured. I don't think we're going to see any more 8, 14, 20% periods of growth. We can't. I mean, we can't.
Yeah. But Dan, to your point earlier, and sorry, Melanie, we've just hijacked this conversation, but listen, Dan, you were saying it earlier. If you were to tell anybody that after 2 years of 20 to 30% growth, we're still going to have 5% growth for the next 5 years in a row, not a chance. So it's the fact that not only we're still seeing growth, but we're seeing growth on top of unprecedented years.
Right. Yeah. It's not, it's not like it's not like you were coming out of this, you weren't in the valley.
Right.
And all of a sudden you saw, this artificially depressed industry. Right. You were seeing an industry that was bumping along, and if we go back and look at what the industry did pre-pandemic, you were seeing 3.5%, 3.7% growth regular. And that's what I mean. That's kind of where we started the conversation. Our models were built around, it's usually going to be somewhere between 3.5% and 4%. And if you're in Vegas, you could bet on that and you'd win. If you said, I'm going to take over 3.5, you'd probably win. Yeah. But never did we see, now we're up here and we're growing from up here.
Pretty remarkable.
And I think, but you talk about headwinds and supply chain, like we said, isn't going to be relieved as a headwind. I hesitate to put any kind of date on it, but at least not for the majority of 2022.
No.
Labor is an issue that's not going away. And that leads me to kind of another, I had alluded earlier to this fact that some of the challenges that independent retailers are facing from drinking from this fire hose is you have these independent retailers that had all these profits. They had these great sales. They are primed and saying, we want to grow. We want to figure out how to put this money to these profits to work for us. But now they're hampered by, well, I'm having a hard enough problem right now getting the products on the shelves that I'm trying to sell.
Yep.
So how am I going to get in stuff for a new niche? How am I going to get in stuff to fill a new location?
Yeah.
Then when you talk about like greenfield expansion, it's like, well, how do I find land? How do I get labor? How do I hire the people to work in a new location? So I mean, I think we're seeing this somewhat artificially depressed sort of growth opportunity for retail in the industry. And I think it's the same thing for manufacturers. And you guys are a lot closer to that than we are. But I'm sure there's manufacturers that are thinking, man, we'd love to be ramping up this. But I think right now manufacturers are making investments and ramping up production for their 4 or 5 main product lines and trying to fill those orders. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with all this. We think on the independent side, we're going to start seeing more acquisition activity. We're going to start seeing people getting out of the industry and these people that are operating smaller chains expanding by buying existing locations and so on. And it'll be interesting to see how that the effect that comes out of the manufacturing side of the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, I think certainly the manufacturing side, they've got challenges with availability just as retailers do. I think they're being faced with pressures from line reviews, be it at the big level or even at the more independent local level of, suppliers now need, I need 4 brands instead of 2, because if brand 1 doesn't have it, I need brand 3 and brand 4 to make sure that there's something on the shelf. So I think, they're facing more competition. And we've got data that we just released at the end of last year from our Building Products Customer Guide showing the percentage of DIYers and pros that have tried a new brand of product for the first time. On the DIY side, it's in the 15-25% range. On the pro side, it's in the 20 to 30% range, depending on the category. So you better believe as a manufacturer, it's either terrifying or represents a great opportunity. I think that's the same thing on the supplier side, because when we look at the satisfaction levels, over 90% were satisfied with that new brand that they tried for the first time. So as a supplier, as a retailer, I'm now learning that I may be okay providing brand X, Y, and Z as an alternative because products are becoming more competitive with one another. The customer seems to be satisfied so long as I have something on my shelf that they can pick up.
Well, right. And I think it's a great opportunity, a time for opportunity, that if you were typically brand B, C, or D, and you were fighting to get that shelf space with brand A.
Oh, yeah.
Now, if brand A isn't available, you've got your in. And as you're saying, if customers say, I'm just as satisfied with B as I was with A, well, who's to say, it's really going to shake those kind of relationships up moving forward. So it's a good opportunity to gain market share, but you also have to be very defensive about defending your market share. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of companies that are like, I can only do what I can do. I can only get the product that I can get. I wish I could fill every order, but it's, certainly challenging now.
It is.
Yeah. So Melanie, you got anything else for us?
We'll just keep going. I think it was about 10 minutes ago that Grant apologized for just carrying it, but I wouldn't have it any other way. So yeah, I wanted to kind of leave it to either or both of you to share any parting thoughts. Dan, I wanted to kind of give you a snippet into where we were about a year-ish ago. In our 2020 market measure report, we projected, the sentence here is, we are anticipating a decline in industry sales of approximately negative 0.7% against 2020. So at the end of 2020, we said, we think sales are going to be down a little less than at 1%. Do you have anything to say about your projection?
I said something about a week or so ago, too, about if you can get Alabama and points, why wouldn't you take that? and that ended up about the same way as my prediction, our prediction for the industry in 2021. Like I said, I mean, you know, when we're putting together the report in October of 2020, you use the best evidence at hand, and there's just there's just no way to anticipate. And I think a lot of, you know, again, we're not just pulling numbers out of the air. We have a lot of things that we use outside of just what I think to determine these numbers. And we survey retailers and we look at their feedback and we look at other market trends. And if you look back at some of what we were hearing was retailers were budgeting flat or down. That's what we were hearing from everybody is, oh, if I can comp flat with what I did and if I can go back to what I did in 2019, I'll be happy, you know. And so I think that certainly we can be wrong, but I also think that sometimes it's just indicative of the craziness of what we've seen. I mean, usually in the 25 plus years I've been doing this, you could look around and everybody's kind of in the same ballpark. Everybody's like, oh yeah, you know, our numbers might be slightly different, but we're all kind of in that same area. Yeah. And I mean, it just is what it is. So hopefully, you know, like we said, I don't think people, if you're going to sell more stuff, I think people are generally a little bit more forgiving if you miss your estimate than if you're selling less. So I'll stand with that.
Okay, that sounds good. Grant, any last thoughts for our audience here?
Yeah, I think, you know, as we look at 2022 and to be quite honest, even getting into 2023, where we see opportunity is still with the DIY. So we don't see that falling off a cliff. As we look at data from the Home Improvement Research Institute, DIY product sales are expected to be somewhat flat, maybe up 1% to 2% over 2021. The contractor growth on product sales is anticipated to be around 7%. We've seen similar forecasts from our friends at Harvard when we look at the LIRA that takes into account product and labor, where we're looking in this kind of 6 to maybe 8% growth, depending on who you look at. And as the Farnsworth Group, again, we're really bullish that that's going to come more from the contractor existing home project work than anything else. And Melanie, I think that goes back to some comments that Dan and I were talking about is you got to start with 2020. What was happening in 2020 to understand what was going on and what wasn't? And a lot of that what wasn't happening in 2020, we're still getting caught up with. So bullish on the contractor side this year going into next. Still see some positive growth, worst case flat for the DIY, just given some behavioral changes about how they think about their life, what's driving some decisions, but also that demand picture as we have increased homeownership rates. It's going to sustain a lot of DIY activity that people keep expecting to just fall off a cliff.
Well, thank you both for your time and for talking us through these numbers, and hopefully we'll catch you around this time next year and see how it all shaped up.
Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Molly.
Thanks.